Hello, my name's Roisin, and I love folklore. Hello friends, and welcome back to my channel. So today I wanted to do another video where I was recommending books to you, but I feel like I've covered the majority of the genres and things that I love. But I remembered that last year I made a video of things I love in books, which I will leave in the cards if you are interested. That video was about really niche specific things that I love in books, kind of not quite tropes, but almost just ideas and themes that if I see them on a blurb or in a review, that will make me really want to read a book. Kind of bookish buzzwords, I suppose. And so I thought it would be fun to do some videos where I recommend you books based on those specific things that I love in books, because I figure if I love them, then other people will too. I've already made a video where I talked about books set in remote isolated communities, which is one of the things that I mentioned in that video that I love. So I will leave the recommendations video in the cards above if you are interested. But today I thought I would recommend you books based on folklore, myth and fairy tales. Now, I know that books based on folklore, myth and fairy tales are not exactly an uncommon niche thing to be interested in. However, aside from one of these books, I would say that none of these are fantasy books, and most of the books that are based on folklore, myth and fairy tales have an element of fantasy in them. Oh no, two of these are fantasy, but the others I would say are not fantasy books, but still have the elements of folklore or fairy tale or that sort of thing involved in them, which is kind of what I prefer. I'm not a high fantasy reader or a huge fantasy reader in general. I like some magical realism, some slight elements of magic that's not fully explained, but I don't really care for big huge world building. It's just not where my interests lie in reading. And so even with the two fantasy books in this, they are not so high fantasy. I think they're very easy to slip into. One of them starts off as more historical fiction and gets more fantastical as you go on, and the other is like a middle grade children's book, slightly older children's book. I think it's just easy to read. It's my perfect type of cozy reading anyway. So without further ado, let's get into the 10 books with a mythological, folklore or fairy tale focus. The first one I have on this list is The Island Child by Molly Aitken. This is a book based on Irish folklore with particular interest in the myth of Salkies. This is set on a small fictional island off the west coast of Ireland in the middle of the 20th century and also in Canada in about the 80s. And it is about a woman who grew up on this small island as a girl where there are strong religious elements, a strong Catholic feeling that restricts women to certain roles and is also very shamey around sex and does not allow people to be queer. And it is a very restrictive, tiny, isolated community that are very shunning of outsiders as well. Our main character Una grows up on this island, but we also flash forward in time to when she is older, living in Canada, and her daughter has run away from her, and she's trying to get her daughter back, and we see what's going on. So we flash between these two timelines, her as a child and growing up on this island, and also her in Canada and coming back to Ireland in order to find her daughter again. This is a book that really explores trauma and women's place in the church, and also women who are shunned generally, and it is interspersed with pieces of Selkie mythology. And there is a woman who lives on the island who is English but who lives there with her son and who doesn't have a father, and so because she is an outsider and because she is a single mother, she's very much shunned, although Una is very interested in her, and that's kind of where the Selkie myth feeling plays into this story. I wouldn't say this story has any really fantasy elements, but it definitely has a strong folkloric feeling and rhythm to it, and it's really beautiful, although very harsh and cold in terms of the feeling evoked by the book, but the writing itself is quite lyrical and beautiful. The second one I would recommend, which is quite similar to that, is The Gracekeepers by Kirsty Logan. This is actually a post-apocalyptic book, which is not something I generally enjoy in fiction at all, but because of the kind of mythical folklore-y feel to this one, and because it's kind of related to the Selkies in the last one, it's kind of a mermaidy feeling to this one. So The Gracekeepers is set in a world where there has been a great flood and most people live on ships that travel around, although there are landlubbers as well. And we follow two main characters, one who is a girl who dances with a bear on a circus ship that travels around to the different islands, and one is a girl who was a land person but who, because she has webbed fingers and toes, has been sent to be a gracekeeper, which are the people who deal with funerals in this watery world, where she lives on this kind of pontoon with another gracekeeper, and people bring their dead to her in order to pass them on. just has a lot of buzzwords in it: small isolated communities, a circus setting, and the writing is so incredibly beautiful and whimsical. It has some queer sapphic love going on inside the book, and it's a really, really dreamlike, floaty book. I think obviously because it's set in water, there's that floaty feeling, but the writing really mirrors that, and you definitely feel a kind of airy ambience. You're never quite sure what is real or what's really going on, and you kind of just have to go with it, which is something that I enjoy in books. I don't really want everything explained to me. I like to be trusted as a reader, and I think that Kirsty Logan really does trust her readers. Number 3 is a book that I read very recently, and that is Tyll by Daniel Kehlmann. And this is a piece of historical fiction set in Germany, and another one that has a feeling of something magical could happen, but you're never quite sure if it is happening. Tyll is a character from German folklore, from like medieval times in German folklore, a trickster character, kind of like Loki, I guess, in Norse mythology, although he's not a god. Or Pan from Greek mythology, I suppose, would be another analogue. In this book, he has been transplanted to the 17th century and the 30 Years' War, and we see his childhood growing up in a small rural village in Prussia, I think, and he's ending up as a jester in the court of the Winter King, who is someone who was king for just one winter and then was ousted, but he is kind of living as a king in exile. This book is not told in any linear way. We flash between all of these different parts of his life, of Tyll's life, and are told from multiple different characters' perspectives, which I really, really enjoyed. It's a very dark book, very gothic, I would say, in a lot of the way that it's told, with that kind of fairy tale, dark fairy tale feeling, kind of like Gormenghast, I suppose, which is another one I could mention, but is not actually on my list. And it also does a really good job of the historical setting of the 17th century, and there is quite a fair bit of humour in it as well, but very, very much dark humour. There are lots of really like violent, awful things that happen in this book, like trigger warning for anything you could think that would happen violently during war, because it does happen in this book, because it is set over the course of the entire 30 Years' War. So it did a really good job of like telling me about that time period, because that time period in Europe is not something I know anything about, and so it was really felt really immersive and really wonderful. And so if you love that kind of dark fairy tale, I think that this would be perfect for you. Next, another one set during conflict, and that is The Shadow King by Maaza Mengiste, which tells the story of the women fighters who fought during the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in the 1930s. It's about a woman who decides to turn a peasant boy into Haile Selassie after Haile Selassie has fled Ethiopia for England in order to bring back morale to the Ethiopian people fighting this guerrilla war. Again, it is a very dark book with lots of terrible things that happen during war happening in this book, so I would look up trigger warnings if you need them, but this book is so incredibly beautiful. It isn't based on Ethiopian mythology. Actually, it is a book with a lot of classical Greek references. There's lots of references to Daedalus and Icarus. It also begins with an epigraph from the Iliad and has a Greek chorus of women who speak in different segments throughout. Although not directly referencing any myths, it is bringing the history of women in Ethiopia to the epic mythic history of the Greek heroes. So it is referencing that style of writing and that foundation myth of Western civilization, but telling it from the perspective of women in Ethiopia, which I think is really brilliant and really well done. This book is kind of strangely detached and it does take a while to get into, but I think once you are into it, it's really, really brings you along. There's a lot about layers of power and what you will do for power, so like the men in Ethiopia, how they will treat the women in Ethiopia. And then there is a character who is a photographer who is Jewish, and so his general is threatening him with, if he doesn't go along with what they're saying, he's going to send him back to Italy to experience the Holocaust. It's very much a nuanced book, and it also is so incredibly beautifully written. It has all these sections that are descriptions of photographs that Artoria has taken that are spread throughout, because in the beginning we are going through a box of photographs, which sounds like it's going to be really gimmicky, but it really, really works. And there's all these references to light and sunshine, so that Daedalus and Icarus reference. It's really brilliant the way that everything is kind of woven together. It's incredibly, incredibly strong writing, but is quite a heavy going book, so I think you need to be in the right frame of mind, but I think that it is really well done, and I love the way that it weaves in Greek epic poetry tragedy vibe to this modern day book about historical Ethiopia. Next, another one that doesn't have any specific myths in mind, but is definitely kind of folklore influenced, and that is The Essex Serpent by Sarah Perry. This is a piece of historical fiction, again, set in the Victorian times, about the time of the Mary Anning's discovery of fossils and the obsession with fossils and dinosaurs and things, and the idea that there might be living fossils, like ancient creatures that still live that we can't see, which was kind of an urban folklore, I guess, of the Victorian time period. And so our main character is a woman who has just her abusive husband has just died, and she's obsessed with the science, and so she hears the story of a sea serpent that is terrorizing the Essex coast, and she decides to go and visit there and she takes her son, who is described in a way which suggests he's autistic, although that was not a diagnosis he had, and with her lady's maid, who is a socialist lesbian, which is what you always want in books, and then they go to the Essex coast, and she meets this preacher, and she also has this heart surgeon who has proposed to her and wants to marry her. So there are a lot of themes in this of religion versus science and belief and mass hysteria and folklore and the limits of science, what is actually like scientifically possible, about passion and love and relationships in really complex, heavy ways, heavy as in emotionally heavy, not heavy as in heavy-handed. The writing is really lovely. It really, really feels like a Victorian novel. Atmosphere of this book is really, really good. It made me visit the Essex coast and like describe the Essex coast in a way that sounds so beautiful, which if you are from the UK you will know is not really something that gets talked about very much. East Anglia is very flat, and so it is never considered as beautiful as like Cornwall or the Peaks or anything like that. So it had such beautiful nature writing in it because science, nature, all of that is a very important theme of the novel, and I think it was written in such a way that really worked. Also that rural city dichotomy. There were so many balancing pairs in this book, and I think it works really, really well. One that in my mind always gets paired with the Essex Serpent, possibly because I read them around the same time, but also because it is another piece of historical fiction with some folklore fairy tale thrown in that feels very of the time that it was set, and that is The Mermaid and Mrs Hancock by Imogen Hermes Gowar. So this is set in the 18th century, and it is about a man who is a merchant, and the captain of one of his ships comes back with a mermaid, which is just like 18th century curiosity. It is described as being like the tail of a fish, the skeleton of a fish tail stuck to the skeleton of a monkey, and it's put on display. And there is also, our other main character is a courtesan who has recently lost her patron. He has recently died, and so she's come back to London and doesn't really know what to do with herself. And she is being re-courted by her previous madam, who wants her to come back to the brothel. And so these two lives intersect when the madam wants to set up a party for that first mermaid. Enmeshed in 18th century British society, it is really visceral and gross and down there in the dirty parts of that society. It is not beautiful in any way, although the writing is still beautiful, but it's very like visceral. It has a wide range of characters. It's a really quite sexy book, although not in a like romance book kind of way, but it definitely has steamy parts to it. I guess in a Sarah Waters kind of way. It is one of those books where the setting really feels alive and also has a wide range of characters who I think are all very well realised. It's a book that feels like it's going in one direction, and then you kind of get to the end of that bit in the middle of the book and it goes off again in an entirely different direction than you were expecting, and I think that's done in such a great way. I love the way that it talks about class in the 18th century. I think it does a really good job of showing you the different classes, because it's not among the upper classes, it's among a merchant and a courtesan, so it's very, very different, although the upper classes do kind of get enmeshed in it in some ways. I think it's just such a lush book, and it's so big that there's a lot to get your teeth into. And Mr. Hancock, after the success of his first curiosity, does go in search of another mermaid, and what he finds is not what he was expecting. The next one I want to talk to you about is the one that is kind of a middle grade, I would say, fantasy, which is something that I have found I really enjoy reading as a comfort read, and that is Spindles End by Robin McKinley. And this one is the only one here, I think, that is a direct retelling of a fairy tale, and this is a retelling of Sleeping Beauty, as you would expect from the title Spindles End. And so it tells the story of a baby who is cursed by a fairy and her name day, and someone else takes her away from the palace, and she ends up growing up in this rural area with these fairies. And the fairies are very much like witches. I feel like they're much more akin to what we would think of as witches than fairies. Like, they don't have wings, they're not tiny, they're human sized, they can do magic, that's it. It's just such a lovely book. I feel like that's what I really enjoyed about it. It doesn't tell Cinderella the way you would expect it to tell Cinderella. It definitely turns it on its head. Everything's told from the perspective of one of the fairies and then from the Cinderella character later on, because obviously she's a baby in the beginning. It's such a warm book with a lot of heart. It's very much like about family and about identity and about like your fate not being chosen for you, because the Sleeping Beauty is not the Sleeping Beauty you would expect from the fairy tale. She's herself as a character very different, but I think it's done in a really good way. Like, it doesn't feel like it's fighting the stereotype. It feels like it's very true and wholesome. It has really great characters. I think Robin McKinley is really good at those like warm enveloping fantasies and a really good world building that just feels very true, even though it's so fantastical. I love the way that she writes magic. It feels like really earthy, and I think that this is a really brilliant retelling of Sleeping Beauty in a way that feels modern without feeling like gimmicky, caricature-y, too on the nose. I think that it's very well done as a subtle retelling with a different ending than you would expect, and although I did see it coming, I still really enjoyed the process of getting there. And the other one that is definitely a fantasy that I would recommend is The Bear and the Nightingale by Katherine Arden. And this book is based on Russian folklore, and it is set in a medieval Russia about a man who marries a new wife after his wife dies, and his new wife and his daughter can both see these Russian spirits that are part of folklore that the village people like leave out offerings to, like the hearth spirit, the wood spirit, the river spirit, etc. The daughter sees them as they are and kind of talks to them, whereas the wife is very afraid of them and thinks they are demons. And it is very much a story about like a butting up between church and folklore, which is something that I really, really enjoy in books. I love the aspects of the church, so it's got that the same as The Island Child. I love when religion and belief are woven in with folklore. I think that it's a really interesting aspect of history to play with in this way. And this book I feel like is so atmospheric, so wonderfully, beautifully atmospheric. It feels like very folkloric and you feel like you're very much in Russia, and the setting is really a big part of it. It is also very beautifully written for a fantasy novel. It's not like the most extreme lyrical writing, but I definitely felt like it played on those fairy tale themes in a way that really, really worked. However, I still haven't read the other two books in the series, and I don't know why that is, because I really enjoyed the first one so much, but I need to get round to that. I feel like it's a perfect like book to read over Christmas, although of course that's a long way away yet. I think that this one really has so much coziness to it, as well as like a sharp sting of frost. Number 9, I would like to recommend you a collection of short stories, and that is What Is Not Yours Is Not Yours by Helen Oyeyemi. These are short stories that are either direct retellings of fairy tales, like there is a Red Riding Hood retelling and a Pinocchio retelling in here, or draw on ideas from fairy tales and themes. They are really beautifully lyrically written. Some of them are set in like the modern world, but they work really well. Some of them are set in like a very distant historical time, but they both equally work. There's a lot of whimsy, but it's like darkly whimsical, which is my favourite thing. If you can find something that is whimsical but also threatening, then I'm 100% into that, and I think that Helen Oyeyemi does it really well. I need to read some of her other books, I know, because this is the only one that I have read. But I've been really getting into collections of short stories, and this is potentially my favourite collection of short stories that I've read recently. They are such perfect like jewels. They work so well on their own, but they are also interconnected with characters and themes. So I think that if you are just like dipping your toe into folklore and fairy tale and you want something a bit weird and surreal, then I would go for What Is Not Yours Is Not Yours by Helen Oyeyemi. And then the final book I would like to recommend you is Return to the Enchanted Island by Johary Ravalason. This is a book, this is only the second book translated into English by a Madagascan author ever, and so it's about a kind of entitled rich boy from Madagascar, who is one of the Malagasy people, which are the indigenous people to Madagascar. He is called Oyeyemi, and Oyeyemi is also the name of the father of Malagasy folklore, like the father figure, the father character that supposedly birthed everyone else, you know, as often happens in Foundation myths. And so this story, we hear the parallel story of Oyeyemi the god and Oyeyemi the boy from the 20th century. And so we follow him where his privileged upbringing, but also his like adulthood where he's feeling very disconnected, and then we go back to his travels to Paris, and it's very much like millennial fiction, but with the added aspect of Madagascan folklore, which is a really interesting combination. Very short book, but I think it works really well. It's got that kind of malaise, that ennui that is kind of prevalent in a lot of millennial fiction, but from a very different perspective. Although he is very privileged, like very privileged, this guy who it's written about, which I guess is also common in millennial fiction. But it's exploring his psyche and his relationships, and there's a lot of like disconnect and him not being able to express himself, and feeling disconnected because of his experiencing being very different from other people, and then also this wonderful retelling of Madagascan foundation folklore, and how that kind of the way that they are slipped and connected together, I think is really, really well done, and it was really, really interesting as well. Madagascan folklore is not something that I know well, so it was lovely to have the foundation myth, because it kind of feels like an entry point for people who don't know it very well. So there you go. Those are 10 books with fantasy, mythology or fairy tale foundations that I have enjoyed. I know there are loads that I haven't read that people love, so if you would like to give me any recommendations in the comments below, I would love to hear them, and I'm sure that anyone else who has watched this video would love to know some more as well. Thank you for watching. Please remember to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and to subscribe. I put out new videos every Wednesday, Friday and Sunday, so I will see you again very, very soon. Bye bye!